Picture this. The year is 1307, October 13th, a Friday. Dawn breaks over the cobblestone streets of Paris, but something feels wrong. The air carries whispers of betrayal, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Across France, hundreds of armed men are moving in perfect synchronization, carrying sealed orders that won't be opened until the sun rises. By noon, the most powerful military order in Christian history will be in chains. The Knights Templar, warrior monks who once stood as Christendom's greatest defenders, are about to become its most hunted fugitives, and the man ordering their destruction, not a pagan king or Muslim warlord, but the Pope himself. This isn't just a story about medieval politics or religious power struggles. This is about something far more dangerous, something that threatened to shatter the very foundation of the Catholic Church. Because what if the Templars discovered something during their time in the Holy Land, something so explosive, so heretical, that it could have rewritten the entire Christian narrative? You see, for nearly 2 centuries, these warrior monks weren't just fighting in the Crusades. They were digging, excavating, searching beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. And according to some accounts, they found exactly what they were looking for. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. The official reasons given for their destruction, heresy, blasphemy, worshipping false idols, sound almost rehearsed. Too convenient, too perfectly crafted to justify what came next. Because when you look at the evidence, when you really examine what the Templars became and what they knew, a different picture emerges. One where the Church didn't destroy them for their sins, but for their secrets. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another conspiracy theory about the Templars and their mysterious treasure. But what I'm about to show you goes deeper than gold or silver. This is about knowledge. The kind of knowledge that could have toppled empires and rewritten Scripture itself. Before we dive into the heart of this mystery, let me set something straight. I've spent months researching this story, combing through medieval chronicles, papal bulls, trial records, and archaeological evidence. What you're about to hear isn't speculation or fantasy. It's a pattern that emerges when you connect dots that powerful people hoped would stay forever separated. And by the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the Knights Templar weren't just the Church's greatest warriors. They might have been its greatest threat. The story begins not with swords or shields, but with 9 men and a promise that would change everything. The year was 1119, 2 decades after Christian armies had captured Jerusalem in the First Crusade. The Holy Land was a powder keg. Christian pilgrims were being slaughtered on the roads, and someone needed to do something about it. Enter Hugh de Payens and 8 companions. Knights who claimed their only mission was protecting these vulnerable pilgrims traveling to the sacred sites. Noble, right? Heroic, even. The kind of mission that would earn papal blessing and royal support. But here's the first crack in the official story. These 9 knights, supposedly dedicated to protecting hundreds of pilgrims across dangerous roads, set up their headquarters not at a strategic crossroads or along major pilgrimage routes. They chose the Temple Mount itself, the exact spot where Solomon's Temple once stood, the most sacred and politically sensitive location in all of Jerusalem. And for the next 9 years, something strange happened. Or rather, something strange didn't happen. There are virtually no records of these Templar knights actually protecting pilgrims, no battles fought on mountain passes, no rescued travelers singing their praises. Instead, they seemed to disappear into their mysterious headquarters, away from prying eyes. What were they doing for nearly a decade? According to later accounts, they were excavating, digging deep beneath the ancient foundations, following tunnels that stretched into the bowels of the Temple Mount. Some say they were searching for the Ark of the Covenant. Others claim they sought lost scrolls or sacred relics. But what if they were looking for something else entirely? Something that would explain their meteoric rise from 9 unknown knights to the most powerful organization in medieval Europe, because that transformation, when it happened, was breathtaking. Almost overnight, the Templars went from obscurity to influence that rivaled kings and popes. Money poured in from across Europe. Nobles donated entire estates. The church granted them unprecedented privileges, exemption from taxes, from local laws, even from papal oversight in many matters. They became Europe's first international banking system, financing kingdoms and crusades. Their network of commanderies stretched from Scotland to the Holy Land. They owned fleets, castles, and enough wealth to make modern corporations envious. But power like that doesn't come from protecting pilgrims. It comes from leverage. And leverage comes from knowing things that other people desperately want to keep secret. This brings us to one of the most intriguing mysteries in Templar history. What did they discover during those 9 years of excavation beneath Solomon's temple? Because something changed. Not just their fortunes, but their entire character as an organization. The early Templars had been relatively straightforward. Warrior monks following the rule of St. Benedict, fighting for Christ and protecting the innocent. But as they grew in power and wealth, reports began to emerge of stranger practices, secret initiation ceremonies, mysterious rituals conducted behind closed doors, knowledge that was shared only among the highest ranks of the order. Medieval chroniclers whispered about Templar ceremonies involving a severed head, sometimes called Baphomet. They spoke of rituals that seemed to blend Christian symbolism with something far older and more esoteric. Of knowledge that came not from scripture or church doctrine, but from sources the Vatican would consider heretical. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like the usual medieval propaganda used to destroy inconvenient enemies, and you'd be partially right. False accusations were a common tool of medieval politics. But the Templar story has details that don't fit the usual pattern. For one thing, they were incredibly successful for far too long. If their practices were truly blasphemous, why did the church support them for nearly 2 centuries? Why did pope after pope grant them privileges and protection? Why did Christian kings across Europe shower them with donations and political support? Unless, of course, the church didn't know what the Templars had really discovered. Or worse, they knew exactly what the Templars had found, and for 2 centuries they lived in fear of what would happen if that knowledge ever became public. Because here's what we know about the final days of the Knights Templar that makes their destruction feel less like justice and more like damage control. The warning signs were everywhere, but the Templars seemed blind to them all. King Philip IV of France was drowning in debt, much of it owed to the Templars themselves. The royal treasury was empty, the kingdom was struggling, and Philip's eyes kept drifting toward the Templar commanderies scattered across his realm, each one a fortress of wealth and independence. But Philip couldn't simply seize Templar assets through conventional means. These weren't ordinary nobles or merchants. The Templars answered to the Pope, not to earthly kings. They were protected by papal bulls and sacred oaths. To move against them, Philip needed something more powerful than royal decree. He needed moral justification. He needed the church itself to condemn them. So Philip began a campaign that was as brilliant as it was ruthless. He planted spies within Templar ranks. He gathered testimony from disgruntled former members, men who'd been expelled from the order for various infractions. He collected rumors, whispers, and half-truths, weaving them into a narrative of heresy and corruption. And then he waited for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came when Pope Clement V, a Frenchman who owed his papal throne largely to Philip's influence, proved willing to look the other way. The stage was set for what would become one of history's most effective cover-ups. On that fateful Friday the 13th, the coordinated arrests began at dawn. Templars across France were seized simultaneously, their properties occupied, their records confiscated. The efficiency was staggering, suggesting months of careful planning. But here's what makes the whole operation feel orchestrated rather than righteous. The charges against the Templars were almost cartoonishly evil. They were accused of denying Christ, spitting on the crucifix, worshipping idols, and engaging in obscene rituals. These weren't the subtle heresies of theological dispute. These were the kind of accusations designed to horrify medieval Christians and justify any punishment that followed. Under torture, many Templars confessed to these charges. But torture confessions are notoriously unreliable, and several Templars who initially confessed later recanted when given the opportunity to speak freely. Even more telling, when Pope Clement V secretly investigated the charges on his own, he found insufficient evidence to support them. Yet the destruction continued anyway. Why would the Church participate in dismantling an organization it couldn't actually prove guilty of the crimes alleged? Unless the real crimes were different from the public accusations. Unless what the Templars were actually guilty of was possessing knowledge that threatened the Church's authority itself. Consider the timeline. The Templars had spent 2 centuries accumulating not just wealth and power, but information. They had operated across Europe and the Middle East, interacting with Jewish scholars, Islamic mystics, and Eastern Christians, whose traditions predated Roman Catholic doctrine. They had excavated beneath one of history's most sacred sites. They had access to ancient texts and artifacts that most medieval Christians never knew existed. What if, during their time in the Holy Land, they had discovered evidence that contradicted official church teachings? What if they had found texts that suggested alternative versions of Christian history? Documents that challenged papal supremacy or questioned fundamental Catholic doctrines? In medieval Europe, such discoveries wouldn't just be academically interesting. They would be existentially threatening to the Church's power structure. The Catholic Church's authority rested on its claim to be the sole legitimate interpreter of divine will. Any evidence suggesting alternative paths to salvation, different versions of Christ's teachings, or competing sources of religious authority would undermine the entire system. And here's the truly chilling possibility. What if the Templars weren't just passive holders of dangerous knowledge? What if they were actively using it? Their banking system gave them economic leverage over kings and princes. Their military prowess made them formidable opponents. Their international network meant they could operate across borders and jurisdictions. If they also possessed knowledge that could challenge the Church's spiritual monopoly, they would have been the most dangerous organization in medieval Europe. The Church would have faced an impossible choice. Allow the Templars to continue growing in power and influence, risking eventual exposure of whatever they had discovered, or find a way to destroy them completely while keeping their secrets buried. Philip IV provided the perfect solution. His financial problems gave him motive to move against the Templars, while his political influence over the Pope gave the Church cover to participate in their destruction. Together, they could eliminate the threat while maintaining the fiction that it was all about heresy and corruption. But the most damning evidence comes from what happened after the trials ended. If the Templars were truly guilty of the crimes they were accused of, you'd expect the Church to publicize their discoveries, to use their confessions as warnings to other potential heretics. Instead, the opposite happened. The Templar archives vanished. Their libraries were scattered or destroyed. The details of their secret practices, whatever they actually were, disappeared into church vaults, where they remain sealed to this day. Even the confessions extracted under torture were quietly buried rather than proclaimed as evidence of divine justice. This isn't how you handle defeated heretics. This is how you manage a cover-up. And perhaps most tellingly, many of the Templars' practices and beliefs seem to survive their destruction, emerging later in other secret societies and esoteric traditions. The symbols, the rituals, the emphasis on hidden knowledge all reappeared in groups like the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and various mystical orders. It's as if the Templar tradition went underground rather than disappearing, preserved by those who understood its true value. So, what was the Church's greatest threat? Not armies or political rivals or competing kingdoms. It was the possibility that the foundations of their authority might not be as solid as they claimed, that there might be other paths to divine truth, other interpretations of sacred history, other sources of spiritual legitimacy. The Knights Templar represented all of these possibilities. They had the resources to investigate, the independence to question, and the power to act on what they discovered. In a world where the Church's word was supposed to be final, the Templars had become living proof that alternatives existed. Their destruction wasn't about protecting Christianity from heresy. It was about protecting the Church from competition. And the fact that we're still talking about them 7 centuries later, still wondering what they really knew and what really happened to their secrets, suggests that maybe, just maybe, the Church's greatest threat was never truly eliminated. It was just driven deeper into the shadows, where it continues to whisper questions that power would prefer remain unasked.